The forest was still, almost reverent. A thin mist clung to the pine needles curling between the ancient trunks like something alive and listening. Distant wolf calls echoed through the trees, not aggressive, but mournful, like secrets being passed from one end of the forest to the other. The full moon hung overhead, enormous and silver-white, casting everything below it in cold, clean light. Elara stood in the center of the Blackwood clearing with her heart pounding. Not from the cold, though the cold was real and sharp against her skin. Not from the ceremony, though 300 wolves stood around her in the dark. Her heart pounded from the knowledge she had been carrying for 6 weeks, the warmth in her chest, the pull, the thread she had followed here tonight like a tide following the moon. But she had felt the bond building since the last new moon. She had told no one. She had simply come. Her name was Elara. Just Elara. No family title. No rank beyond the one stamped into her file at 14 years old after the hierarchy tests came back with their verdict. Omega. Least dominant, least powerful, least significant. The bottom of the order, the classification that followed you into every room and sat down before you did and made its own introductions. She was 21 years old, dark hair falling loose to the middle of her back, eyes the color of deep forest water, a face that people described, when they described it at all, as quiet. They thought her weak. They always had. They thought the Omega classification told the whole story, that the label on the file was the same as the person inside it. They thought their scrutiny would crush her if she dared to stand somewhere she did not belong. But pride was not weakness. Elara knew this the way you know things that have been tested and survived testing. Pride was fire. And fire, she had always understood, could burn everything down. Or it could light the path forward. The difference was in the hands that held it. She stood in the clearing, and she held her fire quietly, and she waited. The crowd had already seen her, and the whispers had already started, moving through the assembled wolves like a slow, uncomfortable tide. An Omega? The Alpha's mate is her? The quiet one from the lower quarter? That cannot be right. She barely has a shift. Elara heard every word. She kept her chin level. She kept her eyes forward. She had been hearing those words her entire life. She had learned to stand inside them without flinching. She had learned that words aimed at you only landed if you opened a door for them. She kept the door closed. Then the crowd went quiet. Not from a signal. The quiet came on its own, the way silence spreads when something powerful begins to move. Alpha Riven was crossing the clearing toward her. He was 26 years old, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with storm-gray eyes that had never once in his adult life looked uncertain about anything. He moved through the world the way mountains moved through landscapes, not aggressively, simply with the absolute certainty of something that could not be moved. He had led the Blackwood Pack through a border war, 2 succession challenges, and a drought winter that broke 4 neighboring packs. He was, in every measurable sense, exactly what a pack needed in a leader. Strong, decisive, proud. That last quality was the one nobody talked about. Proud the way a man becomes proud when strength and authority arrive young and stay long and nothing in his life ever meaningfully pushes back. Proud in the way that turns quietly corrosive when it goes unchallenged. Proud in the way that looks at a gift from the moon goddess herself and asks, before anything else, what will this look like to other people? He stopped 3 feet from her. The mate bond between them blazed. Hot, wild, undeniable. A thread of fire connecting her chest to his, pulling taut as he closed the distance between them. She felt it in her bones. She felt it in the space behind her ribs. And for one luminous, suspended second, she let herself believe. He felt it too. She could see it. That single, unguarded fraction of a second where something real moved across his face. Recognition. The bond landing in him exactly as it had landed in her. Undeniable. Alive. He felt it. And then she watched something else happen. She watched him look at her. truly look, cataloging what he saw, the simple dress, the lower quarter girl with the omega file and the quiet face, and the complete absence of any status that would reflect well on him in a room full of watching wolves. She watched his expression change. The bond pulsed between them, hot and insistent and real, but his pride pulsed louder. She could see the calculation moving through him, the weighing, the deciding. His jaw tightened. His gray eyes went flat, and Riven Blackthorn, Alpha of the Blackwood, the most powerful wolf in the territory, spoke. I reject you. 4 words, flat, certain, final. The silence that followed was absolute. The rejection hit her like a blade between the ribs. The warmth she had been tending for 6 weeks was ripped from her chest in an instant, not simply emotional pain, but something physical and total and devastating. Like losing a color from the world, like reaching for a sense you did not know was holding you upright and closing your hand on nothing. She did not cry. She did not plead. She did not crumple or reach for him or make a single sound. She absorbed the pain the way she had absorbed everything this pack had ever given her, quietly, completely, without performance. She looked at him for one long moment. She saw the pride in his face. She saw beneath it very briefly the first distant flicker of a man beginning to understand he has made a mistake. The kind of flicker that comes too late, moves too slowly, and costs too much. She did not wait for it to develop. She nodded once, small and precise, and she turned, and she walked into the shadowed forest. The crowd parted for her without a word. Nobody spoke, nobody followed. The last sound she heard before the trees closed around her was 300 wolves exhaling in collective relief, as if a complication had kindly removed itself, as if she had simply obliged them all by disappearing. She walked until she could not hear them. Then she ran. She ran until her lungs burned, and the cold cut through her dress, and the moonlight through the canopy was the only light left in the world. Then she stopped. She pressed her back against the broad trunk of an ancient pine and slid down slowly until she was sitting in the roots, knees drawn to her chest, the cold of the forest floor seeping through the thin fabric of her dress, and she let herself feel it. Not the pain, not yet. The truth first. She had felt the bond. She knew he had felt it too. She had seen it, that single unguarded second before the shutter came down. He had felt everything she had felt, the warmth, the pull, the undeniable certainty of the moon's own choosing. And he had rejected it anyway. Not because of politics, not because of external pressure or impossible circumstances. She would understand those things. She was a practical woman. He had rejected it because of her, because she was Omega, because she was from the lower quarter, only because she was quiet and unadorned and carried no status that would look impressive reflected back at him in a clearing full of watching wolves. He had looked at what the moon offered him and decided that his image was worth more. She held that truth and turned it over and did not lie to herself about what it was. Then she made 2 decisions. The first was that she would never again make herself small for anyone's comfort. The second was that she was leaving. She reached into the pocket of her dress and found the small carved wolf figurine the Moon Temple Keeper had pressed into her hands on her 16th birthday. She had carried it every day since without fully understanding why. The keeper had held her hands in both of hers and said, "There will come a night when everything breaks open. When that night comes, go north. Follow the old roads. There is a door waiting for you." She pressed her thumb to the tiny crescent moon carved into the figurine's chest. It was warm. She looked up at the moon through the branches. Pride was fire, she thought again. And fire, lit correctly, did not destroy the one who held it. It showed the way. She got to her feet. She turned north. She started walking. She walked for 3 days. The first day was grief. She let it be grief completely, every step a releasing, a letting go of the small house with the blue door, the healer's wing, the quiet morning runs through the forest when the pack was still sleeping. the life she had built carefully in the margins of a world that had never made full room for her. The second day was anger. Clean, honest, was clarifying anger, the kind that burned away everything false and left you standing in the plain truth of what had been done to you and why. She shaped it carefully, the way you shape fire, keeping it useful and directed and never letting it spread. The third day was planning. By the time she crested the final ridge and saw the temple carved into the rock face above the tree line, ancient stone, crescent moon above the arch, candlelight in the narrow windows, she had a direction. Not yet a destination, but direction was enough to begin. She pressed her left wrist to the crescent carving above the door. The birthmark there, small, silvery pale, crescent-shaped, the mark she had always kept covered without fully knowing why, blazed with a soft silver light. The door opened before she knocked. The woman in the doorway was ancient, Sync's white hair braided back with silver thread, eyes the pale blue of winter sky before snow. She looked at Elara the way you look at someone whose arrival you have been arranging for a very long time. "You are here," she said. Her name was Seraphine, High Keeper of the Moon bloodline. She had been waiting for Elara specifically. She said so plainly, without drama, the way you state a fact that has simply always been true. That first night, across a stone table with a single candle between them, Seraphine told Elara what the mark on her wrist actually was. It was the moon-marked designation. It had not appeared in 3 generations. It meant Elara had never truly been Omega, not in any way that mattered. The hierarchy tests measured dominance, aggression, and shift speed and territorial instinct. All the things the current pack system valued. Oh, nothing else. They could not measure what Elara carried because what she carried existed entirely outside the hierarchy. The moon-marked were the moon's own appointed, not bound to any alpha's authority. Keepers of the oldest gift, the ability to commune with the source of all wolf power, to feel the web of bonds connecting every wolf in a territory the way other wolves felt weather, as pressure and direction and temperature and truth. The moon-marked were not just a legend. They were the power beneath the soil, the heartbeat of the pack, the untamed fire of the Moon Queen herself. And Elara, despite everything, despite every label and every dismissal and every voice that had told her what she was and was not, was tied to that pulse. Whether she had accepted it or not, she had always been tied to it. It had been waiting for her to come home to it. "Teach me," she said. Seraphine nodded once. "That," she said, "is exactly why you are here." 3 months passed. Elara trained at dawn in the temple courtyard and studied by torchlight at night. Every strike, every movement, every breath of the cold mountain air was a lesson in patience and in power. The two were not opposites, she was learning. Patience was not the absence of power. It was the most disciplined expression of it. Her body grew stronger. Her presence, once the kind that people looked through, became magnetic in the specific way of a person who has stopped apologizing for the space they occupy. Her mind, always sharp, grew razor-edged from the hours in the temple library, as reading bloodline maps and ancient histories and the records of every moon-marked wolf born in 800 years. She found her own name in those records, written 3 generations back, prophesied, awaited, deliberately hidden from her by a pack hierarchy that had no category for what she was and had chosen suppression over acknowledgement. She sat with that knowledge for a full night. Then she went back to training. The bond with Riven, the severed end of it, still tugged at her like a shadow she could not fully shake. She had expected it to fade. Seraphine had explained why it had not. You could not fully sever a bond to a moon marked. The moon held a portion of it open regardless of what was spoken in any clearing. The connection did not die. It waited. She felt it in small, stolen moments. Brace a particular quality of stillness in the mountain air that reminded her of the clearing. A warmth at the edge of her chest in the early mornings before the training began, when the mind was quiet and the body was not yet occupied. She did not reach for it. But she did not lie to herself and pretend it was not there. It was there. It was simply no longer the most important thing. It was during the 4th week of training that Riven came to the mountain. She had not expected him. Nobody had warned her. She walked out of the temple at dawn for her morning forms and found him standing at the edge of the courtyard, arms crossed, his gray eyes steady and unreadable in the early mist. He looked the same. Of course he did. 3 weeks was not enough time to change the shape of a man. He was still broad and dark-haired and commanding, still occupying space with the unconscious authority of someone who had never been asked to justify his right to it. But he looked tired. She stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. The bond pulled between them, tugging, insistent, refusing the distance. She said nothing. Focus. His voice cut through the mist, finally. Not harsh, deliberate. The voice of a man who had come here with something prepared and was now standing in the actual presence of her and finding his preparation insufficient. She tightened her stance. She kept her eyes forward. She could feel the pulse of the bond between them. Pride and something rawer than pride tangled in the space between his chest and hers. She felt his sharp inhale from several feet away, betraying the connection. A whisper of regret and restraint that he had not meant to let her hear. She heard it, and somewhere beyond the tree line from the direction of the path that came down from the northern pass, she heard Kale's soft laugh carry on the morning air. He had come with a message for Seraphine and had stayed 2 days, and his easy presence had become, over those 2 days, something that steadied her in a way she had not yet found words for. The sound of his laugh, easy and unguarded and entirely without performance, settled something in her chest. She did not look toward it, but she felt it steady her, and she was grateful. Riven noticed. She knew he noticed. He was too observant not to. She watched the shift in his expression, something tightening briefly before he pressed it back down behind the alpha composure he wore like armor. "I came to—" he started. "You came," she said quietly, "because the bond pulled you here and your pride cannot tolerate not understanding something." He was silent. She looked at him fully then. Direct and unwavering, and without the deference she had always unconsciously offered him before. The small self-reductions of a woman who had spent her life being classified beneath the men around her. She offered him none of that now. She simply looked at him as an equal. And the equality of it, she could see, unsettled him more than anger would have. "You felt it," he said. "That night. The bond. You felt it the same as I did." "Yes," she said. "And You made your choice," she said. "You made it clearly and publicly, and I understood exactly what it meant. I am not angry about it anymore. But I am also not standing here waiting for you to work through your regret in front of me as though my time belongs to your process." He flinched. It was small, barely visible. She noticed. She turned back to her training forms. He stood at the edge of the courtyard for a long time. She could feel him there. The bond hummed beneath her skin, steady and persistent and aware of him in spite of everything. She did not let it move her. She breathed through it. She let her body find the forms. She let the power move through her the way Seraphine had taught, like water finding its natural course, like fire finding the right fuel. When she finally looked up, he was gone. She stood in the empty courtyard with the mist thinning around her and the morning light beginning to warm the stone. His sharp inhale had betrayed him. His presence had given him away. And she was not just surviving this, she realized with a quiet certainty that settled into her bones. She was seen. Finally. Fully. By someone worth being seen by, herself. That was the one that mattered most. Days blurred into weeks, strikes landed with precision. The moon-marked abilities. Seraphine was drawing out of her hummed with her intention, responding to her will the way things respond when they were always yours and simply needed to be claimed. She learned to feel the bond network, the invisible web connecting every wolf in the territory, the way you learn to feel weather, as a physical reality you moved through rather than a concept you understood. With each passing day, her pride hardened. Not into arrogance. She had seen what arrogance looked like in Riven, and she wanted none of it. But her pride hardened into something more useful, a shield and a promise, a shield against the voices that had spent 21 years telling her what she was not, and a promise to herself that she would never again let those voices write the story. She would never be dismissed again. Not because she would fight against dismissal, because she would simply be so fully and completely herself that dismissal would become an impossibility. You cannot dismiss what you cannot look away from. She was becoming something that could not be looked away from. Near the end of the 3rd month, Seraphine told her about the Northern Gathering. The major pack alphas of the Northern and Central Territories assembled every few years. The Blackwood Pack would attend. Alpha Kale of the Northridge, an ally of the Moon Temple and a man Seraphine described with unusual warmth as someone whose pride lives in his character rather than his reflection, had agreed to escort Elara as the Moon Temple's appointed envoy. Not as a guest, not as a ward or an attachment, as the Moon Queen in her own right, with her own title and her own authority. And the Blackwood Pack would be there. Riven would be there. Elara stood at the temple's highest point and looked south over the mountain range toward the territory she had left. She felt, from here, the distant warmth of the Blackwood Pack bond, 300 wolves, familiar as old music. And at the center of it, contained and restless and quietly unwell in a way she suspected he was not admitting to anyone, Riven. She did not feel triumph about his restlessness. She did not feel much at all about it. She turned from the view and went back inside. She had 3 more weeks of training, and she intended to use every hour. On the morning of the gathering, Kale arrived at the temple to collect her. He was not what she had imagined. She had half expected a man in the Riven mold, dominant and contained and projecting authority like a weather system. Kyle was not that. He was tall and broad and clearly powerful, yes, with red gold hair and a face that had spent considerable time outdoors. But his authority sat differently. It wore differently. It was not performed for the room. It was simply present, the way the ground was present. Solid, reliable, not requiring acknowledgement. He looked at Elara when Seraphine introduced them, and the look was total. On not the assessment of hierarchy, not the automatic ranking and filing that wolves did with strangers. He looked at her the way you look at something you want to understand fully, with patience and genuine attention. Then he smiled. Not a charming smile, just a real one. "The Moon Temple did not do you justice," he said. Elara looked at him carefully. She had received compliments before that were really just strategies. She knew the difference. There was nothing strategic about Kale. He said what he meant. She would learn this about him over the coming weeks, but she sensed it already in the way he held her gaze. No flicker of calculation, no secondary agenda running behind his eyes. She held out her hand. He shook it like an equal, firm and unhesitating. She decided quietly that she liked him. It was a small decision. She did not yet understand how large it would become. The Northern Gathering was cold, the wind sharp against her face as they arrived. The great longhouse at the edge of the Grey Pine territory blazed with firelight through its tall windows. Outside, wolves of all ranks stood in clusters, their breath misting, their eyes sharp and calculating in the way of people who spent their lives in political rooms and trusted very little. When Elara stepped through the courtyard gates beside Kyle, a silence moved through the assembled wolves. Not the silence of deference, the silence of recognition. The moon-marked designation announced itself without her needing to do anything. The mark blazed on her wrist in the cold air, and every wolf within range felt it in their blood. Sees that deep, instinctive response to something older and larger than the current hierarchy. Every head turned. Every eye found her. She walked through it without breaking stride. At the entrance to the longhouse, Kale's eyes caught hers, a flicker of acknowledgement, quiet but heavy with meaning. He had brought her here knowing exactly what she was walking into. He had prepared her for none of it, because she had not needed preparation. He had simply offered his arm and his presence and the steady certainty of a man who believed in what was walking beside him. She had arrived. Not just at the gathering, at herself. At the version of herself she had been trying to reach through 21 years of small rooms and careful silence and labels that never fit. She had arrived. Inside the longhouse, she felt Riven before she saw him. The bond pulsed, a deep, insistent throb, unwilling and tethered, the severed connection that had never fully closed, pulling tight as a wire the moment she entered the room. She felt it with the clarity of the moon marked now, felt the shape of it, felt his awareness of her igniting on the other side of the room the way a flame ignites when oxygen reaches it. She did not look for him immediately. She let the introductions happen. She met each Alpha's eyes in turn, direct and unhurried, without the downcast deference of an Omega or the performance of someone trying to prove something. She was simply present, fully, clearly, unapologetically present. Then she reached Riven. Their eyes met across the table. The bond blazed between them, invisible to everyone else and devastating to both. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she saw, nodding in the detail of his face, the full arrival of what 3 months of regret had been building toward. He understood what he had done. Not abstractly, not theoretically. In the full specific detail of a man looking at what he gave away and finding it even more extraordinary than the part of him that had, quietly, always known. Riven, unwilling, was tethered. Kyle, steady and unwavering, was present at her side, and Elara, finally, fully, embraced the power she had earned, not performed it, not wielded it like a weapon, simply inhabited it the way you inhabit your own skin when you have finally stopped trying to make it smaller. She held Riven's gaze for a moment. Then she turned to Kyle. A small smile touched her lips. She was no longer an Omega. She was a storm, a fire, a moon-marked rising, and everyone in that room, including Riven, especially Riven, felt it. That evening, she found herself near the window at the far end of the hall in a brief, still moment between conversations. She stood looking out at the courtyard torches, her hands loose at her sides, and she felt rather than heard Riven approach. He stopped several feet behind her. She did not turn immediately. She let the bond hum between them, that persistent, damaged, refusing to die connection. She let him stand in the fact of her before she gave him her face. Then she turned. He looked the way powerful men look when they have finally run out of the armor that power provides, stripped back to something more honest, something that cost him to wear. "I owe you the truth," he said. She waited. "I was ashamed," he said. He said it directly without dressing it up. She suspected that directness cost him more than any apology would have. "I felt the bond," he said. "I felt all of it. And I looked at you and I thought about what they would say, what they would think. I found better-sounding reasons, and I told them to myself convincingly enough. But the truth was I let my pride make that decision, and I let it speak in front of 300 people while you stood there with more dignity than I have ever managed in my life." The fire crackled nearby. The room held its breath. Elara looked at him for a long time. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "It is the first honest thing you have ever said to me." He held her gaze. "I am sorry," he said. "I believe you," she said. "And I have already forgiven you, because carrying unforgiveness would cost me something I am not willing to spend on this." Something shifted in his face. "But forgiveness," she said, "is not the same as returning to where we were. There is no returning. Not because I am punishing you, because I am not the same person who stood in that clearing, and you would not know what to do with who I am now." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked across the room to where Kale stood with 2 Alphas, easy and present and orienting toward Elara, with the natural gravity of a man drawn to what he genuinely admired. As if he felt her attention, Kyle looked up. His eyes found her. He smiled, that real, unguarded smile. She turned toward it slightly, the way a plant turns toward light. Unconscious. True. The bond in Riven's chest throbbed. Too late, too late, too late. I hope, Elara said, turning back to Riven one last time, that you find something worth more than your pride. She said it gently, as a genuine wish. Then she walked across the room toward Kyle. His hand came to rest at the small of her back, easy and warm and without performance. She looked up at him and said something quiet, and he bent his head to hear her, and the ease between them was the ease of two people who had found in each other the specific relief of being known. Riven stood at the window for a long time. He did not go after her. There was nothing to go after. She walked through the forest later that night, alone, the mist curling around her boots, the trees silver and still in the moonlight. The gathering sounds had faded behind her. Ahead, the path curved toward the Northridge guest quarters through a stand of old pines. She was thinking about the evening, about Kyle's hand at her back, about Riven's face, about the bond and the forgiveness and the clean feeling of a chapter fully closed. Then a soft voice came from behind her. "You have changed." She did not turn. She knew the voice. She knew the weight of the footsteps that had stopped a short distance back. She felt the bond hum beneath her skin, that faithful, persistent, bittersweet thread that the moon refused to fully sever. She let it hum. She did not reach for it. "Yes," she said simply. A long silence. "I know," Riven said, "and I know it is because of me." She was quiet for a moment. "It is because of me," she said. "You were the catalyst, but the fire was always mine." The mist moved between the trees. She let the bond hum one last time between them, acknowledgement, not invitation. The recognition of something real that had existed and been mishandled and could not be recovered and did not need to be. Then she walked forward. She did not look back. Some stories, she understood, were only beginning. And this one, her story, the real one, the one written in the moon's own hand, was only just finding its true first page. 3 weeks later, under the full moon at the Northridge Pack grounds, with the Moon Temple elders assembled in witness, Elara and Kyle stood facing each other. She had not expected it to happen so quickly, but Kyle had sat across from her on the temple steps one evening and said, without preamble, "I am not a man who wastes time when he knows what he has found." And then he had looked at her with those direct hazel eyes and asked if she would do him the honor. She had sat with it for one night. In the morning, she had said yes. Standing in the moonlit clearing, she felt the mate bond rise between them like a sunrise, warm and solid and vast and completely different from the sharp, anxious pull she had felt for Riven. That had been the moon knocking on a door. This was the door swinging open onto something larger than she had imagined was behind it. It was not desperate. It was not dramatic. It was the feeling of something settling into its right place after a long time out of alignment. She looked at Kale's face as the bond completed between them. He looked like a man who had been expecting something good and found it better than he imagined. His eyes were bright. His smile was the real one. The unguarded, unhesitating smile that was his truest face. "I see you," he said quietly. "Every part of you. And there is nothing I would change." The words landed in the exact space that had been hollow since the clearing. They filled it. She felt complete, not in the way of a woman who had needed a man to be whole. She had made herself whole in the temple, and the training courtyard and the cold mountain nights. This was different. This was the wholeness of a person who had found their equal, someone who met her at her full height and was not diminished by what they saw, but enlarged by it, pride and strength and the warm, steady weight of being genuinely respected. She brought Kale's hand to her lips. He laughed softly, surprised and delighted, and she laughed too, and it was easy, the way laughter is easy between people who have found the right frequency. The news reached the Blackwood Pack on a gray Tuesday morning. The Moon Queen had bonded. Riven was alone in his study when Colt brought the message. He read it. He set it on the desk. He stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the pack territory he had built and protected and given everything to. The village below moved with its ordinary life. Wolves going about their work, children on the lower paths, the irreplaceable ordinary business of 300 people who depended on him. He had done right by them. He pressed his hand to his chest. The bond was still there. The moon held it open regardless of what he had spoken in the clearing. He felt, from the southern study of his Blackwood home, the distant warmth of her bond completing with another man. Not sharply, not with acute pain, just the quiet, settled, permanent warmth of something that had found its home. Somewhere that was not here. He put the message in the desk drawer. He went back to work. That winter, at the pack fire, a young female wolf looked up at the moon and asked him what the Moon Queen was like. He looked at the moon for a long time. "She is," he said, "the most remarkable person I have ever met." The girl nodded, and the conversation moved on. Riven looked at the moon a while longer. He thought about pride, about the things it cost, about the specific quiet grief of a man who made a choice with his ego and then lived inside the consequence of it. Not in ruins, not dramatically, just carrying it like a stone in the chest that was always there. Small enough to work around, heavy enough to feel every day. He had been proud. She had been extraordinary. He had let the first thing blind him to the second. And she had gone and become a queen. And he remained here, which was exactly as it should be, and exactly what he had chosen, and he was wise enough now to understand that those two things were both true, and would remain both true, and that maturity was learning to hold them without needing to make them simpler than they were. In the Northridge that same winter night, Elara stood on the high balcony of the longhouse she and Kyle had made their home. The moon was full and enormous above the snow-covered peaks. It blazed on her wrist mark and on the cold, clear air and on everything below her that was hers now, her purpose, her place, her people, her belonging. Kale came through the door behind her and settled his arms around her from behind, easy and warm, and she leaned back into him with the uncomplicated comfort of a woman who felt safe. "You are thinking," he said. She could hear the smile in it. "I am always thinking." "What about tonight?" She looked at the moon. "About a girl," she said, "who stood in a clearing once and let herself believe." He was quiet, holding her. "And now," he said. She smiled. "Now I do not need to believe," she said. "Now I simply know." He pressed his lips to her temple. She turned in his arms and looked at his face in the moonlight. Those direct hazel eyes, that real and unguarded expression, the easy certainty of a man who had recognized something extraordinary and been neither threatened nor diminished by it. She thought about the clearing, about 4 flat words and the cold walk north and the temple door and the white wolf on the mountain slopes and the woman she had assembled herself into from the pieces the world had tried to scatter. She thought about Riven at the window of his Blackwood study, carrying his stone. She felt no triumph. She felt something quieter and truer than triumph. She felt grateful for the rejection even, because the rejection had sent her north. The rejection had led her to the temple door and Seraphine's pale blue eyes and the knowledge of what she actually was. The rejection had been the catalyst for the fire finally waking up. She would not have chosen that path, but she was grateful she had walked it. She took Kale's face in her hands. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said. "For looking," she said. "For not looking away." He smiled. He covered her hands with his own. Outside, the Northridge territory spread below them in the moonlit snow, and the pack was at their fire, and the night was cold and clear and enormous and entirely hers. She was home. Not in the way of a place she had always lived, in the way of something found on the other side of loss, earned, and therefore permanent in a way that things simply given could never be. She was the Moon Queen of the North. She was bonded to a man worth bonding to. She was whole. And somewhere in the Southern Territory, a proud alpha stood at his window in the dark, carrying the quiet consequence of a choice made from the wrong place. That was his story to live. This one was hers. The best kind of ending, she thought, was not revenge. It was simply arriving at the life that had always been meant for you. The mark on her wrist glowed soft and silver against the winter dark. The moon blazed. Kale's arms were warm, and Elara smiled, not the cold, calculated smile of a woman managing her image. Not the careful expression of someone who had spent too long in rooms that required performance. Just a smile, real and easy and entirely her own. She had arrived.